Hello, everybody. All right, this is going to be a quick summary of macromolecules, which we covered at the beginning of the year. We are skipping over the properties of water review for the end of the year exam because I feel like we've beat that like a dead horse. But if anyone needs further review on properties of water, there might be one or two questions tucked into the quiz on biochemistry at the end of the week, and you'll definitely see it on the final exam. So if anyone needs any extra help on properties of water, send me a private message. I'll upload some additional materials. Now for macromolecules, there are 4 different types of macromolecules that you need to know, and you also need to know their basic structure, what their monomer units are, because remember, macromolecules are long polymer chains made up of these smaller repeated monomer subunits. So a protein, a lipid, a carbohydrate, or a nucleic acid is a long polymer chain of monomers. So for the macromolecules, you need to know what the 4 macromolecules are, their structures, so what atoms make them up: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, which is in all of them, and then proteins, which are made up of amino acids. They have that nitrogen in them, and then nucleic acids have nitrogen and phosphorus, in addition to carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So if we remember in order, going with carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and then nucleic acid, it goes cho, cho, chon, chomp. So you need to remember that carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids all have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and then proteins with the amino acid monomers have nitrogen, and nucleic acids have nitrogen and phosphorus. Phosphorus linked together the sugar bonds between the nucleotide pairs on nucleic acids. So starting with carbohydrates, you need to know the structure and function. So carbohydrates are polymer chains of saccharide monomer units. Saccharides are sugars. You can have monosaccharides, disaccharides, trisaccharides, or polysaccharides. That is those smaller sugar rings that then link together to form the large sugar. Examples of carbohydrates are glucose, fructose, sucrose. Are you seeing a trend here? A lot of carbohydrates end with ose. Cellulose, that makes up plant cell walls, is another sugar. And these carbohydrates, these sugars, function to supply small amounts of energy for cellular processes. Remember, glucose is the main carbohydrate that is used in cellular respiration, how our cells make ATP energy. So remember that carbohydrates are used to supply small amounts of energy for our cells. And they are made up of saccharide monomer units, and some examples are glucose, fructose, sucrose, and there's a way to tell carbohydrates apart from other macromolecules, and that is that they only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and those carbon, hydrogens, and oxygens are always in a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio. So for example, C6H12O6 has 2 hydrogens for every 1 carbon and 1 oxygen. That's glucose, if you recall, and it is a carbohydrate. So they always have the 1-to-1 ratio of carbon, hydrogen to oxygen. That's how you can tell a sugar apart from a lipid, say, if all you're going off of is knowing that it is only made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Moving on to lipids. Now, lipids are fats and oils. They are used for long-term energy storage. So in their fatty acid tails, they can hold a lot more energy. There's a lot more hydrogens and oxygens in a lipid because they make up those hydroxide fatty acid tails. Lipids are not only used for long-term energy storage, but they are also used to make up the cell membrane of all of our cells, those phospholipids that make up the phospholipid bilayer. So they have those two functions. Their structures are they have a glycerol head and then those fatty acid tails. They're made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And some examples of lipids would be fats, oils, butters, or cell membranes. Another example of a type of fat or oil that you might have heard of or may see again on your final exam or in your quizzes are steroids. We did talk about that when we discussed the function and structure of steroids at the beginning of the year, but they are another example of a type of lipid. Moving on. So we get a little bit more complex when we get into proteins. Remember, they are the CHON of cho-cho, chon, chomp. They have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and they also have nitrogen groups because they are made up of smaller monomer subunits of amino acids. If you remember from all of our work in the year, amino acids, they link together to make proteins, and this work is done by ribosomes. After the mRNA makes a copy of the DNA, takes that over to a ribosome. Ribosome starts pumping out amino acids. Remember, you had to look at that codon chart. Those amino acids then link together to form proteins. Proteins form these long chains that fold up into really complex patterns, and depending on what the protein is, it will have one of very many different functions. Proteins are the most diverse of the macromolecules. There are thousands of different types of proteins that do all different kinds of jobs in our bodies and in other living things. So they have multiple different functions. The amino acids have that nitrogen to carbon core. So if you see a molecule structure that has a nitrogen linked to a carbon and then another carbon, and that subunit, that monomer, is repeated over and over, that is an amino acid sequence, and that makes up a protein. Some examples of proteins. Remember, enzymes, which we'll talk about again on Wednesday, are proteins. So lactase is the enzyme that dissolves the sugar or carbohydrate lactose. That's one that we talked about frequently. Other types of proteins, you can find them in nuts, beans, eggs. The major protein that is found in eggs is albumin. You've also got protein in your muscles. That is myosin and actin. So a lot of proteins actually end with in. So we can see that trend of os with carbohydrates and in with proteins, and ace with enzymes, which are proteins. So just some trends we see in the naming of these macromolecules. And finally, your fourth macromolecule is going to be the nucleic acids. Remember, nucleic acids are DNA and RNA. They have a, DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. RNA is ribonucleic acid. So the NA in DNA and RNA stands for nucleic acid. Now, DNA and RNA, they have a pretty complex structure compared to carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, but it's always the same. There is a phosphorus group that is bound to a sugar group, okay? And that sugar ring down here could be deoxyribose, which would make it DNA, or ribose, which we see in RNA. And then those are linked to our nucleotide groups, which could be A, T, C, or G. Adenine, thymine, cytosine, or guanine if it's DNA. And if it's RNA, what happens? Instead of a thymine, we've got uracil, a U instead of a T. So we've got the phosphorus group that is bound by covalent bonds to the sugar group, and then the sugar group is bound to the nucleic acid, or the nucleotide, the nucleotide right here. And then in a double helix, that nucleotide, whether it's A, T, C, or G, is going to be bound to another nucleotide on this side. And what goes in between the bonds of DNA are hydrogen bonds, because they are easily broken when it's time to split open the double helix to make a copy of DNA during replication or during transcription and translation. So for the structure, you have sugars bound to phosphorus and nucleotides, hydrogen bonds that tie together nucleotides, covalent bonds between the sugars and phosphorus groups, and either a double helix for DNA or a single strand, a single helix for RNA. That's the structure, and then the function is to contain our genetic material. So all of our genes, again, are expressed by the pattern and sequencing of those codons, how nucleotides are arranged. And so our DNA and our RNA functions to help us express our genes, so they contain our genetic material. So that is a quick overview of the 4 macromolecules, their structure and function. Look forward to another video on Wednesday about enzymes, and if you have further questions, I suggest you watch the video links that I'll be uploading for the Amoeba Sisters videos, or additional videos that might help you that you can view online. Also, email me if you have any questions as you work through your worksheets or prepare for the quiz on Friday. All right, guys, see you later.